everybody.
Hi, good afternoon.
And hello, Mark.
Thanks, Helen. Hi.
Mark, do you think there's such a thing as a stupid question?
It's complicated, that. I've worked in various companies where the chief executive at some point says, there is no such thing as a stupid question. And believe me, there really is. And I've been in rooms where they were asked, but as a general principle, no, it's correct that I understand why people say it, because it should encourage anyone, no matter how young, to ask a question. And if anyone here remembers, if you've seen the various films or plays about Enron, Enron collapsed because the journalist asked the question, how does Enron make its money? And they said, don't be so stupid, that's a completely stupid question, but actually it was a very good one, as it turned out. And the company collapsed because their wealth and their share price was an illusion. So that's a great example of what, and actually the journalist in that case said, I'm sorry if this is a stupid question, and it wasn't. So no, there isn't.
Do you reckon you've ever asked one that isn't a stupid question?
That is or isn't?
Or maybe a question that you've thought, oh, that was a bit stupid.
No, I've never, no, well, I mean, I just think you have to not think like that. I mean, it depends what kind of interview it is. I've interviewed 3,500 people at least for TV, radio, or newspapers. And it depends the level of risk. So this week I'm doing an interview for The Guardian with someone, and I will just take more risks. I mean, because I've got the tape and I will transcribe it. You've got to be careful in broadcasting because you have a producer in your ear. And a very clever and successful journalist, her career was quite badly affected because the producer said in her ear during a discussion, but what is DNA? And she repeated this on air. And it severely affected her reputation because people seen her as someone who would know what DNA was, and she did. Now that's complicated because that was what's known in broadcasting as being the viewer or the listener's friend. But you tend, or I would anyway, I mean, you tend to fudge it around by saying, you know, for anyone that hasn't studied Latin or physics or, you know, ever could you just, my great friend and mentor, who was a huge influence on me, Melvyn Bragg, Lord Bragg of Wigton, one of his catchphrases in our time is, could you just unpack that for us? Which you see, again, you could see as a stupid question, but it's not, because it just gets, but so you try to avoid hideous embarrassments on air, in particular if it's live. I've done a lot of live interviews. The recorded ones, again, there's less risk. So yeah, in the live interviews, you would just think, if you don't quite know what, if you're not sure about something, you would be more cautious. So I'll stop in a minute. But so if you're doing live broadcast interviews, it's as if you're listening to yourself on a slight delay, and you will hopefully stop the question or sentence before it becomes too embarrassing. That's why broadcasters tail off sometimes with 3 dots, because they realize they're about to end their career.
Hopefully not from me today, though.
No.
So you're asking questions, I think, often on behalf of the audience in your series. You're asking questions that we want to know the answer to. How would you tap into that beforehand, or do you just ask what you want to know?
Now, I mean, sorry, it sounds patronizing, but that's a very good question. I mean, it's very hard to, it's the most difficult thing is to establish before any interview what is the purpose of this interview. So the kind of interviews that a lot of you will have done or been on the end of, the purpose of a job interview is to decide whether the person is fit for that job or you want to work with them. In the kind of stuff I've done, it's a really difficult balance. I mean, I've interviewed J.K. Rowling 2 or 3 times, I think TV, radio, and print. And that's a really difficult one, because if you say, what do people want from that interview? There will be people who want to know, why does Harry play that shot in Quidditch in the Chamber of Secrets? Why does he use his left foot or hand or whatever? I don't know very much about British, but I can't remember the rules. But you see, they really, really want to know it at that level. And then there will be a group of people who only want her to be asked about her views on trans rights. And then there are a group in the middle who just want to know, which is what I would want to know actually, how do you go from sitting in a cafe in Scotland as a very poor single mother to being one of the most powerful people probably in the world, because of the amount of money. But also that you see J.K. Rowling, and there's a lot of snobbery about her still, but when people look back at history, there'll be a few writers, I think, Dickens is one of them, Ian Fleming, who wrote the James Bond and Chitty Chitty Bang Bang books, who just have this extraordinary gift for writing popular literature. And so for me, you want to get somewhere, you might consider, go somewhere near the two other areas, but really you're getting to that. The thing I've always remembered, because it shaped my career a lot, is that I discovered, just when I was starting out in the 1980s, God help us, that the first regular interview series in an American, in any newspaper, it happened to be in America, which was in the 1880s, was called What Are They Like at Home? And I think that's a really good question there, because if you interview Joe Root, we mentioned today, Harry Brooke, Kamala Harris, whoever, Keir Starmer, you of course want to know about their public life, but what you really want to know is, what are they like at home? And so I always keep that question in my head. And Sir Martin Amis, I say sadly late now, but one of our great writers who died recently, and he did a lot of interviewing, and he helped me early on, because I talked to him about doing literary interviews. And he said, what you're telling the reader is, what is it like to be in a room with that person? And I think that's another very good question. Just get a sense of the space of them in the room, how they behave. Don't become too obsessed with whether they tap their left foot, as I am at the moment, but you might mention it once. But you just be alert to all of that.
And you're sort of there breaking, I imagine these people must be interviewed thousands, if not more times across their career. How do you break out of asking the questions that they're asked every day and into something perhaps deeper or more personal?
You can't always, and it was a real shock to me once. For radio, I interviewed Sir Terry Gilliam at the end of a day. Anyone who's seen Notting Hill, there's this thing called the junket, and they still go on. They go on less now because actors have got wise after COVID, and they do them on Zoom now. But they used to come to a hotel in London normally, sometimes Manchester, Leeds. I'd asked for the last interview of the day because we wanted more time than most people got, because we were doing a half-hour special with him. And when I got to him, it was his 30th interview of the day. And the previous 28 had been translated from the Japanese or into Japanese with a simultaneous translator. And I mean, he was catatonic by the time we got to him. But on the other hand, I thought it's so amazing to me. This is how they live their lives, these people, that I got him to talk about that, what it's like to give 28 consecutive interviews in a language that you don't speak, in which indeed he was being asked the same questions every time. And I think he said he even learned bits of Japanese because the translated answers were all the same, because it was always the same question. So that's one. But you just try to start with something people don't expect, not in a gotcha way, which is the thing people say about journalists, but just start somewhere different. So when I interviewed Spike Lee, the film director, many years ago, I'd seen him on Match of the Day, a cutaway to him at Arsenal, and I thought, that's interesting. So we started talking about Arsenal, and he's quite a difficult interviewee. I mean, he's a very, very great film director, but he's quite a difficult interviewee. He's been asked a lot of stupid questions, but he really engaged on that. because he hadn't expected to be talking about Arsenal and why he supported them. So that's a good example.
Yeah, I imagine we can all relate to sort of sitting on back-to-back Zoom calls all day, and
Yeah,
that
all
initial
of
sort
that.
of break out of the norm within the day is...
I just think also, I mean, one thing I was just remembering, be interested and enthusiastic. So, there's a thing that goes on which is called, in the term in journalism is a cuttings job, where you read every interview they've ever given and you interview them about those interviews. And I hate that. I like to start from a blank sheet of paper. But yeah, curiosity and interest. I read a lot of newspaper advice columns, what used to call agony aunts or uncles, not because I have a lot of problems, but because I write fiction, and it's the most amazing insight into people's secrets and psyches in those columns, because, people write in and say, look, I'm having an affair with my sister-in-law and my brother-in-law, and now my fiancé has found out. And it's just so extraordinary. But one of the most common, and I hope not too many people in this room engage with this fact, but it's quite startling to me. One of the most common letters to advice columnists is, I've been going out with this guy, and it is normally a guy, for 2 years. And in that time, they have never asked me a single question about myself. And you do hear that anecdotally a lot, and it just fascinates me, because they need to go on a course. But if you've got a problem with your, and this one, interviewing is a formal thing that some people do. We're doing it now, and you do it for jobs. But it's such a huge part of human life, interviewing people. Conversations with people. One of my mentors in journalism said, everyone has got something interesting to tell you. It's broadly true. It's very occasionally at certain weddings and dinner parties it gets stretched, that one, but it is broadly true, because people love talking about what they do for a living. So, I got picked up by a taxi driver the other night, and he said, "Oh, so thank God you've turned up, because the previous 4 didn't turn up, and so I don't get paid." And I said, "How does that work?" And it was and then he talked about the whole system. So I think that's good.
And I suppose in that situation, you've not met the taxi driver before.
No.
But some of your interviews, you will have met the people before and built up a relationship. And how does that affect the dynamic of the conversation that you're having across years, where you're having these conversations?
That's one of the big questions in interviewing are the best interviews done by people who have never met the person before, or by people who have an established relationship and trust with them? I think it can vary in each case. I think you have to be very careful. Actually, in this, well, it's not in this city, is it? Because it's in Salford, but Matt Chorley on 5 Live, who has a long history of interviewing Boris Johnson, he very bravely actually did what, we take all the terminology from spying, from John le Carré's novels, but he burned his sauce this week. That's not a cooking thing, it's S-O-U-R-C-E. He was so direct, I think in a good way, and rude to Johnson, that I don't think Johnson will ever give him another interview. And you have to be prepared to do that. In the arts, it obviously helps if, I've interviewed a lot of writers about, 7 or 8 of them, their books over a 20-year period. And I think in that case, it is useful because they know you know their work. The biggest complaint from writers is that they're being interviewed by someone who has never read any of their work, and that's quite a serious problem. You wouldn't accept, if you were a cricketer or a footballer, being interviewed by someone who hadn't seen you play, and I don't understand why it's different myself.
Yeah, and that, I suppose, the burning the sauce, the breaking relationship, brings us a little bit to, as we were speaking at the start, where if you encourage that culture of openness and dialogue, then you're also, I suppose, risking questions that might risk breaking a relationship or...
Yes. That's why, in my view, you shouldn't ever meet them before the interview. I mean, even if you've met them before for a previous interview, don't meet them before the next one until you do it. Because that's where they say, could we not mention the fourth and fifth wives? You know, could we not mention this? And it's really difficult once that's been done. And it's a nightmare now with the streamers in particular. I mean, probably Apple Plus are the worst, I think, in my experience, but they try to control every aspect of it, and they want to know all the questions in advance. If they could, and they do try, they would give you the answers in advance. I mean, sometimes they offer to do the interview. This is quite common now.
To do the interview?
Yeah, they say, you know, Nicole's really busy, but I could just do an interview with her and then give it to you for your publication. It's very bad for business. But that isn't about that. It's about control. And I mean, obviously, you talk about this all the time, but everything has changed because of social media. And the scrutiny now on an interview. I mean, Matt Shawley, you know, this week, while he was interviewing Johnson, he had in real time X's and texts coming in saying, "How dare you treat this man like this?" You know, and indeed the opposite. You know, you haven't exposed the level of liar that he really is, and that's an extraordinary new thing for broadcasters. Is that the, you know, having a producer in your ear is one thing, but having an audience to that level is really, you know, that's a huge new development, I think.
It sort of widens the conversation more than two people, maybe the 200
yes,
watching.
but it also puts more pressure on, and it probably will make most interviewers more nervous, you know, of what they say. Because I was brought up a Catholic, and so the confessional that you have in Catholicism, I've always thought that's a very good model for the interview.
Okay.
Not necessarily in terms of, you know, people aren't necessarily admitting sins, but I just think that
We've got time.
it led, but what it was, you know, and it's awful because it led directly to abuse in some cases. It made it possible, but it was this dark box in which you were looking through a grill into the face of this priest. So the aspect of it I try to get into that. So when I do TV interviews, the longest possible tape, I think it's 2 hours is the longest you can get. Push the cameras as far back as possible, bring the lights down. So that, and that's why, you know, radio interviews are often by far the most revealing, because it's just, there is no crew. I mean, there is, but they're behind the glass. It's just you and the person in the room, the studio. And I like to have the lights low so that you can. So that's what I mean about the confessional thing. It should ideally be you and them locked together, and the fewer interruptions, the better.
So you're thinking a lot there about the environment that you're asking the questions within. When you're preparing in advance, are you thinking about what answers you want to get from them and forming the questions around the answers you're looking for rather than the questions that you're interested in?
Because I mean, I also, among the other things I do, I mean, I write radio plays and novels, and it's a dialogue, and it may be for this reason, but before the really big interviews, so John le Carré, David Cornwell, who I did a number of long interviews with, and because he was a trained spy and one of the great dialogue writers in English literature, I thought I had to take this very seriously. So I think I spent about 4 days, and I wrote, well, I'll ask this, and then he might say that, he might say that. And then there was a whole, like, you know, if he goes to that answer, I'll go to this question. And I wrote it as a play, really. It was like a screenplay by the end because it was so long. But yeah, and that's an extreme case. But I think you have to, but then you have to also be prepared to throw away the plan. And I know it's difficult if you're interviewing for jobs, so you have to ask all the candidates the same questions. But I think with a more informal interview, it's really important to leave space for stuff to happen in the room. I mean, I drive around the country quite a lot for going to theatre and football. So I live in Northamptonshire, so I come to the north really quite a lot to watch them lose to people, Northampton Town. But I listen to a lot of local radio, and you do it horrifies me. You hear someone will ask a question, and then the interviewee will say at the end of it, yeah, I haven't talked about this before, but yeah, so that's when I killed my mother. And then they say, and then in 1998, you made the film so-and-so with, and it's because they've got a list of questions. And a producer once shouted in my ear, oh my God, they've answered question 9 before question 2. And I couldn't care. I mean, it's, but you have to, so that's the thing, and this does apply to relationships, job interviews, everything. Listen, you have to. There are, you know, all interviews have terrible flaws, and I do, but the worst one that I think interviewers have is not listening. And if I've ever seen an interview go really, really wrong, it's because the interviewer has not listened to the... And there are certain politicians, you know, and you sympathize with them, and they'll say, but I answered that 2 questions ago. And it's because the person is just following 1 to 10, which has been worked out. And it's difficult because of, you know, impartiality and broadcasting. You do have to plan your questions. But I think you also have to, with a pen, think, oh, well, they've done 2, so then I don't do 2, or they've done 3.
Mm. Yeah, and that, it sounds to me that it's not just the case of actually listening, but showing that you're listening, and it being the person feeling comfortable and acknowledging that they're hearing.
Yes, so that's the thing, you know, which we all want in life. Yeah, you want to think that... I was once interviewed by someone on the radio about a book I'd written, and they were writing the link for the next item while interviewing me. And they had a book open in front of them, which unfortunately wasn't mine, they discovered when they looked at it. And yeah, you don't feel that you're being listened to in those circumstances.
Mm. What advice would you give as someone who clearly helps people feel like they're being listened to enough that they can open up to the next question, for someone to actively listen and make people feel
I think it's, again, like I said about the confessional, really, or, you know, in talking to your loved ones, you ideally, it's got to be as much of a cocoon as possible. You know, particularly in the TV interviews, we always had it took 10 minutes at least to get the interview back on track after, if they came in to do makeup or there was a tape change or a light blew, which is a quite common thing in broadcasting, you would lose the momentum and the energy, and that's what we got back. So I go to theatre a lot because, you know, one of the things I am is a theatre critic, and what actors are taught is to be in the moment every moment, and I do think that's very useful for interviewing. That it's like, you know, there's an energy between you, and if you start getting bored or nervous, they will. I mean, this is just how things work.
Yeah, that's hard, I think. I don't know, honest for a second here, when you're having a conversation with someone and you're then thinking, oh, I need to make sure that I respond to this in the right way, or I need to, the next question I'm following up, that's a lot of different threads to follow in your mind all at the same time. I suppose leaving, as you said, leaving space between allows for that.
Well, I think you have, I think you have to have a plan, but you also have to be prepared to abandon the plan. So there's a quote I often use, which is Mike Tyson, the boxer. He said, everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And in an interview, you should not actually do that. Although Jeremy Clarkson did once, actually. But you should actually do that. But it's quite a profound thought, which is that, from Mike Tyson, which is that you can plan and plan and plan. And this, it's not for me to say, but I mean, this almost certainly applies to business. But if something changes, then you have to be ready to change. And I think that's important in all. And, you know, again, I've seen interviews in which they were so determined to get one thing that when it became apparent they weren't going to get that, or it was a false premise or whatever, they just kept going.
Kept going to get to the same point.
Well, to ask the same question over and over. I mean, there's one extreme case, Jeremy Paxson, my old colleague, and I mean, not very well at the moment, but he was, you know, one of the greatest interviewers. He with Michael Howard, the then Home Secretary, for younger people in the room. He asked him the same question 14 times on Newsnight. And he claims it was because the next tape wasn't ready, and they said, just keep going. But actually what it was is that he suspected, as we have to say for legal reasons, he suspected that Michael Howard was lying to him. And so he thought, and it's quite a good instinct actually, is, well, if he's going to lie, then just let him, allegedly lie. If he's going to allegedly lie, then we'll really go for it. He can repeat it 14 times. It's all on YouTube, but it's an amazing moment, or series of moments. But it's like tennis, or that once you get into a rhythm, it's quite hard to get out of it. So once Paxman had asked the same question for the 5th time, Michael Howard, and there's this, this external thing judging what you're doing if you're the interviewee or the interviewer. So Michael Howard is thinking, can I just say this is ridiculous? Can I walk out? And actually which is what happens in tennis, he dropped into the rhythm of the interviewer. And neither of them could stop until eventually Paxman did. But it's not, many people have tried to do it subsequently, but it needs to be in a very particular circumstance in which it's pretty clear that you're not being told the truth.
Mm. In that scenario where you're thinking in advance that there's a particular answer that you'd like to get during the interview, or a particular topic you'd like to get into, and the person you're speaking to doesn't, for whatever reason, isn't giving you the answer, how do you adapt or flex to either get there or change on the
I think you've got to decide when to let go. I mean, a historian, Antonia Fraser, she said something I think really interesting about King Henry VIII. She said that if you write about King Henry VIII, you have to realize he doesn't know that he's going to divorce all these women. He thinks that each one is going to be the real thing. And so you see, people aren't always lying. So if we'd been able to interview Henry VIII, and in our cynical journalistic way, we said, come on, Henry, this one's not, I mean, you'd lose your head at that point, so you'd have to be quite careful, but come on, Henry, this one's not, how long is this one going to last? Is this going to be like 8 weeks or 10 weeks? And he would have been terribly affronted, because that's not how he saw himself. He saw himself as someone who had finally found the right. And in the end, it's like, I mean, I knew a journalist who went beyond Henry VIII. He was married 8 times, actually. But, and in the end, it's like musical chairs, that there is one, someone eventually will be the one, just through the process of time. But this guy used to get really upset when people said, oh, God, I'm not giving you a present this time because I've given you a present the last 4. And it really infuriated him. And he said, no, I've fallen in love for the first time. So I always think that's quite useful, that people are not always lying. They may be lying to themselves, but that's a different thing. And so you have to judge what kind of lie it is.
Yeah, interesting. And like deciding that on the spot, and whether you'll dig into that further or... Yeah, and
and I interviewed a lot of writers and artists, and they're terrible judges of their own work. They'll say, you say, well, in 4 of your books, there's someone who's abandoned by their mother, and that happened to you. And they say, no, I don't, no. Wasn't thinking about that at all. And interestingly, they're not lying, and they eventually... sorry, do you have time for the story? Very quickly. So
we have time.
There's a book called The Beatles Lyrics, in which Paul Muldoon, the poet, interviews Paul McCartney about his lyrics. And it's hard to believe, really, but it appears to be true. When they get to Let It Be, and Paul Muldoon, a Catholic, I think, says, well, Mary, the mother of Christ, is supposed to have said, let it be. But your own mother was called Mary, and she died when you were a teenager. And so therefore, Mother Mary speaking words of wisdom, let it be, is an incredibly emotional line. And he says, yeah, I never really thought of that as being about my mother. You see, obviously it is, and Muldoon is right, but it's, he's not lying about that, and that's one of the things that critics and interviewers do. You can help people to make discoveries about their work, which is the best thing, actually, because I wouldn't have been, you know, very occasionally someone will write to you and say, oh, that, you know, I understood something about myself from that interview. Rarely, I mean, it's more, you know, you'll hear from my lawyers or that kind of thing, but no, in the best cases, those, I mean, there are letters I cherish where someone said I hadn't understood that about myself or my life because, and that will be a long interview, obviously, but those are the good moments.
Yeah, you're building up really meaningful relationships there over time, just through asking questions that make them think.
Yeah, except that essentially all interviews are failures because you never get exactly what you hope for, but then that's just what. And I think you have to be realistic about it. I mean, I work with someone who, there'd be catastrophic errors, or, you know, the interviewee's head would fall off in the course of the thing, or the studio would burn down, and they'd skip out of the studio and say, wow, that went really well. And I think it's slightly worrying temperament, that, because it suggests a lack of self-criticism. So I think you have to be, and I may go the other way, and as I say, I think all interviews fail at some level, apart from this one.
Apart from this one, yes, clearly.
But yeah, so you've got to be self-critical.
Okay, on self-critical then. Is there one question that you wish you'd asked and comes back to you and said, oh, I wish I'd asked that?
I mean, it seems horribly smug. No, because if you've done enough preparation, and that's why you have the plan. So that is more likely to happen to people who interview without any kind of plan, because it's like when Ed Miliband did that speech without an autocue and he forgot the bit on tax. So you have to be really careful. So yeah, I always, you know, even the one I'm doing this week for The Guardian, for a newspaper, I'd always have a list of questions. And then, you know, when you're thinking, have I asked all those? So I don't think that's ever happened to me. The other side of that, which is any that I've regretted, yeah, but most of them end up on the cutting room floor or in my my little tape recorder. So you can always, you know, unless it's live, you can always get back from, you know, as disastrous as that. I mean, six people walked out of interviews that I did. But I don't actually regret those questions because I think it seems sacrilege to do it in this place. But yeah, so Alex Ferguson, he walked out of an interview with me. And that was actually, this ties into everything we've been talking about, which is that, so we're given 8 minutes for the radio, but not live, recorded 8 minutes. And normally, comfortably, you would think, well, 10 questions I'll have on my sheet of paper, and that would easily cover 8 minutes. And after 3 minutes, we'd got through all of them because all he said was aye or nay or just complete silence. And then I asked I thought, you know, it was my one that if that happened, I thought, well, this will have to encourage him to open up a bit. So I'd done I can't remember what the sums were at the time, but it was something like, I said, I noticed that 18 of your first team squad have published autobiographies. And I said, that must be quite an extraordinary thing for you. I mean, you must go, you know, even if you just go through the index, it must be really interesting that there are 18 people who have written about being managed by you. And he said, never read one of them, never. And so we were, and it was desperation, really. And then I just thought, I'd watched one of their matches on Sky the weekend before, and he was famous. I mean, people who follow these things, Fergie time was a famous thing that he, I mean, essentially, I probably get lynched if I say this here, but so essentially the view of other fans was that if Manchester United was winning, he wanted the game to stop after 90 minutes dead. And if they weren't winning, they were drawing or losing, and then he wanted it to go on for another 15 minutes. That was essentially how Fergie time worked. But if they were winning, he used to do this thing. He had this gigantic watch, because footballers and football managers do. And he used to hold it up to the camera and like that. And I said, and this was the most disastrous question ever, really. I said, I was watching the match of the weekend, and it must be really quite difficult, the thought that there's a camera on you all the time, because that's what Sky brought in, because they have so many cameras, they can have one on the manager. And I'm just interested in how conscious you are of that. Does that make you self-conscious? And he did his usual never think about it. And I said, oh, but that thing you do where you hold up your watch and you tap it at the camera, I said, that's a bit theatrical, isn't it? And he went berserk, actually. And all we know, and thankfully things are much these days, there isn't any of this sort of prejudice, but some people have suggested that in his Scottish childhood and adolescence that theatrical had certain implications that he hadn't liked. But I don't know if it's that or not. I think, in fact, it was just that and it happens to politicians, and it may happen to CEOs, who knows. They're just so used to only being told what they want to hear that any criticism, and you see that, actually, I realize now when I talk about it, what had happened there is that he was used to controlling everything, and he wasn't in control of that interview. Neither was I, as it turned out, but I thought I was. But, and it would lead ultimately to Manchester United TV, in which the current manager, is he still the current manager? Do we know anyway? They are interviewed only by people from the club, and that's the way that was heading then.
Yeah.
And he was banning journalists from press conferences, which is a bad look, I think. But that was all about controlling the questions.
I'm afraid we have no Fergie time today.
No, well, thank you. Should I just whiz through the others who walked out? So Jeffrey Archer walked out. And yeah, he was a big... one of the Bee Gees, yeah. I lost a Bee Gee at one point.
That's an incredible line.
But we've got through the whole...
We've got through. Nobody's walked
We
out.
haven't walked
I don't
out
think.
yet.
I wasn't watching too closely.
Well, no, we're going to walk out now. But,
we are.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for chatting to me today. Thank you so much for your
Helen.
attention. Have a good rest of your day. After that.
Thank you. Thank you.